Now, what's happening among Northern whites is a radicalization. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the voiding of the Missouri Compromise line, the caning of Charles Sumner, now the Dred Scott decision. And so you start seeing a radicalization of Northern whites. You start to see the consolidation of the Republican Party is becoming even more intense. And this radicalization is not a sense of needing to go to war to end slavery. Most whites, that was the last thing they wanted, especially Abraham Lincoln. He did not want a war to end slavery. What he wanted to do, and you should write this down because I'll expect to see it on a quiz or a midterm or something. He wanted to put slavery on the road to ultimate extinction. He thought by containing slavery in the states where it existed, that it would die out because, as I've talked about, slavery needed soil, it needed to expand. Southern whites also believed this too, that if slavery didn't expand, it would die out. So this is something where Northerners and Southerners basically were on the same page, that slavery had to expand in order to thrive, except Northerners don't want it to expand and Southerners do. So you get a radicalization of Northerners who just do not, who feel like there needs to be a takeover of the federal government, that a legal takeover of the federal government, that Southerners had controlled the presidency, Southerners had controlled the Supreme Court, or pro-South advocates. The South had a large, if not dominant, voice in the House and the Senate as well. So this idea that the slave power conspiracy needed to be checked. So in order to stop the expansion of slavery. And again, said it a million times, this is the issue. It's the expansion of slavery. That's the nub of the question, as Lincoln would put it. So let's talk about Abraham Lincoln for a second. I've got an image of him up on the screen. You'll notice he doesn't have a beard. I'm sure most of you know that he grew the beard during the 1860 election. The story goes that a little girl had written him saying, "You'd look better with a beard." And Lincoln thought, what the heck? So he grew the beard, and that's how we mostly remember him. But he didn't have a beard until the 1860 election. So Lincoln, fascinating figure. I think there's 50,000 books written on Lincoln or something crazy like that. Someone's always figuring out a new Lincoln angle. And born in Kentucky, interestingly, a slave state, along with Jefferson Davis, his counterpart in the Confederacy, president of the Confederacy, also born in Kentucky. But Lincoln's father, who he didn't like very much, took Lincoln out of Kentucky as a young boy, moves to Indiana, and then ultimately ends up in Illinois. So Lincoln grows up in a state where slavery doesn't exist. And he is a deeply, deeply ambitious politician. He's not Saint Abraham. He's someone that wants power. He wants to be elected. He wants acclaim. He's deeply ambitious, and he makes no bones about it. So don't think about Lincoln. He's just sitting there waiting for people to come to him to beg him to save the nation. He is very eager from the time he's a young man to gain political office and to gain power. In those days, you could become a lawyer without going to law school. He becomes a lawyer. He's quite successful. He's quite a brilliant guy, actually. In the 1840s and 50s, he taught himself geometry just to sharpen. He read Euclid on his own just to sharpen his mind. Definitely a brilliant person. The thing I admire about Lincoln, a lot of folks have issues with Lincoln. I do too. He says some stuff that in the 2020s are without a doubt racist, especially before he became president of the United States. But Lincoln had the capacity to grow. Lincoln had the capacity to grow, and that's what I really admire about him. His growth during this period. But Lincoln is the classic example of someone, a white Northerner, he's sympathetic to slavery. He thinks slavery is an evil, but he wants to kill it by containing it, not by going to war against the South. The war came to him. He didn't run for president promising to go to war against the South. He just didn't want the South to expand any further than it did. And we'll talk about Lincoln's growth as a person for the next, I guess, 5 or 6 weeks in this course. So he's elected to Congress in the 1840s. He's deeply opposed to the war with Mexico. He says some things about war that his opponents throw back in his face when he becomes president of the United States, and he wages war against the South. Always very embarrassing. His partner, very famously, his partner is a guy by the name of William Herndon, his law partner. You don't have to remember that name. What he said about Lincoln after his assassination, Herndon said about Lincoln that Lincoln's ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. A little engine that knew no rest. So Lincoln is always looking out for the main chance. He's always looking out for political opportunity. He is a political operator, and he's actually quite a brilliant politician. He also knew how to work the political machine of Illinois, which is where he had settled. He's a respected member of the Illinois bar. He'd served in the Illinois legislature. He's a pro. Let me put it like that. He's a pro. He's a professional politician. He knows what he's doing. He knows what he's doing. Came from a poor background, went from a log cabin to the presidency. And by the way, that's something that the South would not have celebrated. As we've talked about, the South is a very hierarchical society, and Southerners were comfortable with hierarchy. So the idea of someone coming from a log cabin to the presidency wasn't really a calling card for most Southerners. Lincoln leaves office, his congressional seat, in I think 1848, and partly due to his opposition to the war with Mexico. And then he comes back to Springfield, Illinois, and he becomes a corporate lawyer. And he is a very, very successful corporate lawyer. And this is something we don't think about when we think about Abraham Lincoln, that he's a corporate lawyer. And what he becomes, this is the period where railroads are really taking off as a technology. And he becomes known as the railroad lawyer, and he gets paid. He becomes pretty wealthy in the 1850s. These corporations are paying Lincoln a lot of money to represent their interest. And he's very successful, a man of very high standing in Illinois. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the voiding of the Missouri Compromise line, this brings Lincoln back into prominence. Not only does it radicalizes him, but the way to think about it is Kansas-Nebraska and the voiding of the Missouri Compromise line, it opened up a window. It opened up for a space for Lincoln to maneuver in. Before 1854, Lincoln was kind of stymied. It was very unclear. He'd been a Whig, and his political career was going nowhere, although his career as a lawyer was doing quite well. Well, with Kansas-Nebraska Act and all the fallout from that, including the death of the Whig Party, and Lincoln had been a Whig, and the rise of the Republican Party, all of a sudden a space opens up for Abraham Lincoln to maneuver. Lincoln becomes one of the earliest members of the Republican Party. He brings all his expertise with him into the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is a much stronger party than the Whig Party ever was. As I've said many, many times, the Republican Party was a sectional party. It only existed in the states of the North, but the North was gaining population, and it had far more population than did the South. So Lincoln uses the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It radicalizes him in his beliefs, but it also creates a space for him to get back into public life. So, as I said, he gravitates towards the Republican Party, and he's welcome in the Republican ranks. He's the classic example of a Whig who became a Republican. So Lincoln, let me talk about Lincoln and the issue of slavery for a second here. So Lincoln was very consistent on the issue of slavery. For him, the Constitution had sanctioned slavery. Slavery was legal. There's no doubt about that in his mind. He's a lawyer. When you look at the Constitution, there's no doubt that the Constitution protected slavery. It doesn't say slavery, the Constitution, but there is absolutely no doubt that there are protections built into the Constitution for slavery. The Three-Fifths Clause, for instance, that gives slaves, as when it comes to voting, they count as 3/5 of a person, although of course they couldn't vote. This was just when it came to adding up the number of members of the House of Representatives for a state like Texas, and also the electoral votes of a state like Texas. So, long story short, Lincoln looks at the Constitution. He sees slavery as legal, but he also argues, and this gets a little bit more controversial. He argues that the writers of the Constitution wanted slavery to end. That, of course, they protected it, and they had to protect it because otherwise there would have been no United States, because the Southern states in the 1780s wouldn't have signed any document that didn't protect slavery. But Lincoln argues that the founders wanted to end slavery down the road, that they had put it on the high road to extinction. This is a little bit unclear if Lincoln's right historically, and historians still argue about this point to this very day. So Lincoln recognizes that slavery is legal, but he argues that the founders wanted slavery somewhere in the future to go out of business. Lincoln defended the humanity of slaves. To his credit, he did think slavery was a horror. He recognized that. He had sailed down the Mississippi as a young man. He'd seen the slave markets in New Orleans, and he was horrified by what he saw. But he also, before his presidency, he also thought that Black equality in the United States was impractical and unachievable. And this is where we get the side of Lincoln that in today's world would definitely be racist. He did not think African Americans were equal to Blacks. Now, this will change as he becomes president, especially as he sees African Americans fight in the Union Army. But this is where Lincoln is at in the 1860s. He hates slavery. He wants to see it go out of business, but he does not view African Americans as equal to white Americans. He argued that African Americans, and he in the speech he uses the word Negroes, have natural rights, as we talked about before, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that other men have, but they can't enjoy them in the United States. So if Lincoln had had his way, if he'd had his way, he would have wished African Americans out of the United States. If he could have had his dream scenario, all African Americans would have been resettled outside the borders of the United States, either in Africa or in Haiti or in Central America. And there is no doubt about this whatsoever. Lincoln was quite explicit about this, that he recognized that African Americans had the rights that men were have, although he thought African Americans were not the equal of whites. He recognized humanity of African Americans, but he never thought African Americans would ever be able to live in the United States. And that if he'd had his way, that African Americans, he would have wished them out of the United States. He supported all these colony schemes, these schemes to persuade African Americans to leave the U.S. This was Lincoln's game plan: not let slavery expand from where it did, and ultimately colonize African Americans outside the United States. This is where Abraham Lincoln is in 1860. In 1865, by the time he's assassinated, he was in a different place, but this is where he is when we first meet him.